Good evening, everyone. I'm Charlie Kyle, the principal of Innis College, and welcome to tonight's special event, Picture a Scientist, a panel discussion with numerous scientists, as you might imagine. So let me begin by reading the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and celebrate on this land. Tonight's event is a little different from the way things normally work for us. First of all, you may have noticed that we had the film available to you prior to this event, in part so we could give more time to the actual discussion that is going to constitute the main event of the event. And we will have the film available after if you haven't yet seen it and you're wondering, uh-oh, what should I do? Well, obviously stay for the discussion and then see the film afterwards. We have a star-studded group of scientists with us tonight: Shoichet, Maydianne Andrade, and Megan Frederickson, and also one of the directors of Picture a Scientist, Ian Cheney. But before we begin, we're going to do something just a little bit different, which is to have two people give us a kind of introduction / greeting before the event begins in terms of the discussion that will again constitute the main part of the evening. So I should say that the way the genesis of this event was that I happened to see the film quite early in its distribution history as part of Doc Soup. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, well, we have to show this at Innis. And part of the reason I knew we had to show it was because of the longstanding relationship the college has had with Anne Innis Dagg. And Anne's story is an interesting one. And if you haven't seen the film, The Woman Who Loves Giraffes, I would recommend that you do so, and you'll learn why I immediately thought of Anne once I'd seen Picture a Scientist. But Anne has prepared a short video as a way of sort of introducing the film. And I will just begin myself by introducing Anne. So Anne Innis Dagg is a globally recognized scientist and the foremost authority on giraffes, having written the widely acknowledged Bible on the subject, The Giraffe, Its Biology, Behavior, and Ecology, first published in 1981. Initiating her field research in 1956, Anne was the first person formally trained in science to study wild giraffe in South Africa. She has since authored 23 books and published over 60 refereed scientific papers. She is a member of the Order of Canada, the Bakke Human Rights Award, and an honorary member of the Canadian Society of Zoologists. She also happens to be the daughter of the college's namesake, Harold Innis, and was the recipient of an honorary doctorate from the University of Toronto last year. So we'll now show you Anne Innis Dagg's videotaped introduction.
Thank you for joining us today for this wonderful and important event. My name is Dr. Anne Innis Dagg, biologist and author, specializing in the study of giraffes. I was asked to introduce this film, and after seeing it, I can understand why. My struggles with gender discrimination as a woman in STEM date all the way back to the 1950s and are well documented in the film about my life, The Woman Who Loves Giraffes. I believe it is important to acknowledge the contribution of female scientists and to encourage young women to see themselves in these roles. It is my hope that when we ask young people to picture a scientist, the image of a woman comes to mind. Be kind to each other, enjoy the film, and long live giraffe.
Well, thank you, Anne. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the second of our introductory speakers, Professor Melanie Woodin, who also happens to be the Dean of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Arts and Science. As leader of one of the most diverse academic divisions in the world, Professor Woodin promotes the faculty as a global hub for research, teaching, and innovation. Professor Woodin completed a BSc in biology and an MSc in zoology at the University of Toronto, and obtained her PhD in neuroscience from the University of Calgary. Professor Woodin's research focuses on understanding how the brain functions by studying neuronal circuits and the mechanisms underlying learning and memory. Her research is supported by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Simons Foundation Autism Research Initiative, and the Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis Society of Canada. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout for this important topic. Now, more than ever, having just seen the world rush to find a COVID-19 vaccine, working together on a focused goal, we see the critical importance of increasing the diversity of thought, inquiry, and innovation in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. And as Dean of Arts and Science, I would add an A for the arts. There is plentiful evidence showing that organizations fare better with more women in leadership and on boards, and we need to expect no less in the world of STEM. So how can we advance the role of women? By breaking down barriers to entry, which start in elementary school. By ensuring a full complement of mentors and advisors and faculty with lived experiences who look like the next generation of women scientists. And by supporting young scholars along their career journey, no matter where it takes them, inside or outside the academy. I had a passion for biology growing up, but I had no idea what it meant to be a scientist. Where did they work? What did they do? I didn't know. School teachers advised that if I was interested in biology, I should pursue a career in medicine. But I was lucky to come across some field biologists while camping one summer in Northern Ontario. They were likely graduate students, but I was unaware of what that was at the time. I assumed they must work for the Ministry of Natural Resources, and that told me that there were careers for biologists. So I set myself toward that goal and came to the U of T as an undergraduate student. While my interests turned from ecology towards cell biology and neuroscience, I remained acutely aware that I had no idea prior to entering university that I could spend my life researching these disciplines. And I keep that top of mind whenever speaking to young people, even if it's just in casual conversation at the playground or the dog park. You never know whose little ears are listening and what will stay embedded in their minds for years to come. So my heartfelt thanks to Principal Charlie Kyle for his hosting of this event, and to all the speakers and panelists here tonight for sharing their stories and experiences. I'm grateful too to all of you, our guests, for participating and helping advance ideas to clear a path for more women in STEM for a more equitable, just, and healthy future. And I look forward to what I'm sure will be a scintillating discussion. So thank you, and back to you, Charlie.
Thanks so much, Melanie. Well, I now have only one more task, and that is to introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our panelists. So Megan Frederickson, whom I should mention, I saw in a W5 episode devoted to Anne Innis Dagg, and I will confess that I was not aware of Megan, although I should have been. Once I read her bio, you'll know why. And once I saw W5 and I heard what Megan had to say in that episode, I knew she would have to moderate this event. So Megan Frederickson is an associate professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Toronto. She studies how cooperation evolves between species in plant, animal, and host microbe mutualisms. She uses field, molecular, and computational approaches to understand how mutualism and symbiosis affect ecological and evolutionary processes. And if you don't understand any of that, you're probably a humanist like me. We have plenty to learn. She has over 2 decades of experience doing field research in Amazonian rainforests. She earned her PhD from Stanford University and was a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows before joining the faculty at U of T. Her research is currently funded by NSERC and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And her work has been featured in textbooks, nature documentaries, and on the news. She also analyzes data and writes and advises on how to improve equity, diversity, and inclusion in science. And now I think you'll agree there's no one better equipped to moderate this panel than Megan Frederickson. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for that very nice introduction. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in a moment with our discussion of this very interesting film, Picture a Scientist. But before we do that, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce the other panelists this evening, Professor Molly Schoeckett, Professor Maydianne Andrade, and filmmaker Ian Cheney, who made Picture a Scientist. So I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Andrade, who is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. She is also a close colleague of mine. We're both in the same graduate department of ecology and evolutionary biology here at UofT. And her fundamental research uses black widow spiders as models for understanding the links between ecology, evolution, and behavior, topics that are, of course, very close to my own research interests too. Dr. Andrade got her PhD from Cornell, and she started her career as an NSERC University Faculty Award recipient. And she's since gone on to be named a Canada Research Chair, a Fellow of the Animal Behavior Society, and elected an honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. But Dr. Andrade is not just an award-winning scientist. She has also been a special advisor to the Dean on inclusive recruitment and equity education, Vice Dean, Faculty Affairs, Equity and Success, and Acting Vice Principal, Academic and Dean. She's also a very strong advocate for equity and inclusion, and she is the co-founder and inaugural president of the Canadian Black Scientists Network, and also the founder and co-chair of the Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence. She's also recently hosted an episode of The Nature of Things, and she co-creates and hosts a podcast called The New Normal, which examines how the pandemic may catalyze a more equitable society, which is something I definitely want to talk about tonight. So welcome, Maydianne. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Molly Schoeckett, who is a university professor at the University of Toronto, a distinction held by less than 2% of the faculty. She also served as Ontario's first chief scientist in 2018. She's a graduate of MIT and UMass Amherst, and she has published over 650 papers, patents, and abstracts, and given over 420 lectures worldwide, which, to be honest, are just mind-boggling numbers to me. So Dr. Schoeckett's research focuses on drug and cell delivery strategies in the central nervous system and 3D hydrogel culture systems to model cancer. Dr. Schoeckett has also co-founded 4 spin-off companies, and she is the recipient of many, many awards and distinctions, and I'm just going to give you a couple of highlights in the interests of time. She is the only person to be inducted into all 3 of Canada's National Academies of Science, the Royal Society of Canada, Engineering and Health Sciences. She's also been inducted as an Officer of the Order of Canada. Dr. Schoeckett has also been the L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science Laureate for North America, elected a foreign member of the US National Academy of Engineering, won the Killam Prize in Engineering, and most recently, she was awarded the NSERC Hertzberg Gold Medal in 2020. And I haven't had the chance to congratulate her on the NSERC medal yet, so many congratulations, Molly, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
And last but not least, I'll introduce Ian Cheney, whose film Picture a Scientist, of course, we're here to talk about today. Ian is an Emmy-nominated and Peabody Award-winning documentary filmmaker. He received bachelor's and master's degrees from Yale University and an MFA in film from the Vermont College of Fine Arts. He's made 10 feature documentaries, including Picture a Scientist, and has been a former McDowell Fellow and Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. So it's a real pleasure to have you with us tonight, Ian. And I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. But for some strange reason on Zoom, I can't see all of you at the same time. So I'm going to have to just click a setting here. All right, so welcome everybody. I thought I'd start the discussion off with our filmmaker, with Ian Cheney, and ask a little bit about what inspired you to make Picture a Scientist, and to tell us a little bit about the genesis of the film, and how did you go about learning about and choosing the 3 scientists who sort of form the main parts of Picture a Scientist?
Sure.
and I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for hosting this discussion in film. Our journey began really with the story of Nancy Hopkins at MIT, a woman named Amy Brand, who's the head of the MIT Press, became friends with Nancy and started asking around to see if there were filmmakers who might be interested in telling Nancy's story. And Amy and I got connected, and there was something really, having spent time at MIT and having not been aware of Nancy's story, I felt like I'd missed this amazing event and this amazing work. And so my longtime colleague Sharon and I set about getting to know Nancy and exploring the idea at first of just making a short film about Dr. Hopkins and her colleagues, which kind of be a historical film, the story of the 1990s, and kind of reconstruct what happened and how remarkable it was. And as we captured more and more of Dr. Hopkins, reflections on that time and the now 20 years that had passed, the more it became clear that she was really nudging us to make the film and story much bigger and really explore not only her story, but other women's stories, and also what had happened in the 20 years since. She, of course, was well aware that not all those problems had been solved with her work, of course. So we sort of building on what we learned by spending time with Nancy Hopkins and her colleagues at MIT, we spent, I don't know, better part of 3 or 4 months actually having, mostly Skype calls, I guess, in those days, but phone calls and conversations with other women scientists mostly around the States, but a little bit around the world, trying to just piece together a sense of where are we now and what stories might we try to capture that can, not exactly capture the whole picture of this topic, but at least provide enough openings into conversations that we could that the film could do some of these stories justice. And it was during that process that we got to know Jane Willenbring and Rachel Burks, and all three of the scientists who sort of form the backbone of the film had this amazing ability to sort of make us laugh and make us cry. And they were so generous with their time, and especially given how much time they'd already put into this work, and that we were really, I don't know, we're really in their debt. So whenever people sort of thank us for making the film, I always,
Absolutely. I think I was really touched by how brave they had all been in sharing certain aspects of their experiences as women in science. And I want to get back to the topic of where are we now. But before I do that, I wanted to start by asking, I guess, first Molly and then Maydianne about, what their experience of watching this film was. Were there particular moments in the film that really resonated with you? And what moments were ones that were, particularly gripping or particularly familiar? Molly?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. There were a couple of things. Well, I would say, the entire film resonated with me, but I really liked the iceberg analogy and talking about how there's, above, the iceberg that's sticking out, that's like the really awful, like sexual assault, but below the water, it's all these microaggressions and subtleties and stabbing in the back, and some obviously less subtle than others. So that really resonated with me. And the other thing that really I really appreciated was the honesty. So when we were looking at some of those studies that were shown of, you know, associating professions with female versus male, and the person leading that study said, I make these mistakes too. Oops, I'm so sorry. I turned off everything else except for my phone.
We didn't hear it though.
Oh, okay, great. So yeah, that really resonated with me, was that honesty, because I, you know, there's riddles that we, you know, that I'll tell I have two sons, you know, 20 and 22. And, you know, I've tried to raise them as, you know, growing up as a girl in power, like growing up and, you know, focused on girl power, and then having two sons, I realized I could be a role model for my sons in terms of acknowledging that. But still, I really appreciated the honesty of the three scientists that you featured and commented on, Ian, but also just the honesty that we all have grown up in this society that makes those associations. So those are, you know, some things that stood out to me.
Yeah. And Maydianne, how about you? You know, were there moments in the film that were particularly, you know, that particularly affected you or particularly spoke to you?
I would agree with Molly that pretty much the entire film. I think I used the word triggered in the sense that there was so much of this that I could relate to, but also the gratitude, especially to the group, to all the women in the film, the group at MIT in particular. I started as a faculty member in 2000. The year prior to this story broke. And it was incredibly important because earlier in my PhD career, a major paper had come out showing that women were being undervalued for the same work in STEM. This was Wenneris and Wold from Sweden. And nothing really had been done. People just said, oh, well, that's just that one thing over there. It's nothing to do with us. But we all knew that it was more than just that. And so I'd say between that and the other major moment in the film for me was when Nancy said, right then, I have to be an activist. I've had that same recognition just in the last few years. So, you know, those are just some really acute moments.
Yeah, I think I really identified with Nancy Hopkins in the film as well, from the perspectives of somebody who got into science thinking, oh, you know, I just really want to be a scientist, and I really just want to be I want to kind of stay out of, you know, the political side of universities and academia, and I just want to, you know, hunker down and do science. And yet finding yourself in a position where you feel compelled to start to speak out and start to try and advocate for a more equitable future for all of us. And I think many of us have had that experience, have kind of gone down this road towards you know, working away at some advocacy, or taking on more of a role of advocating for improvements and to equity, diversity, and inclusion in academia. And I wanted to ask, you know, the movie is really, or the film, I should say, is really takes a US perspective. You know, it features 3 US scientists working at US institutions, and here we are, of course, at the University of Toronto in Canada. And something I hear a lot in the Canadian context is that, you know, Canada is different from the US. We're more progressive, we're more inclusive, aren't we? And I guess I wanted to turn that question around and say, you know, what do we all think about the Canadian experience relative to the film? Do we think that the stories that are told in the film are common to women in science in Canada as well? Do we think there are differences between the experiences of Canadian academics and US academics? I will let anybody chime in if you have a thought on that.
Well, I can start. I think they're very similar. So I think sometimes in Canada we think we're better for some reason, and I think the experiences are very similar between, you know. But that's why the whole film resonated with me so much. It's that these are very, very similar experiences that we have. There's one big difference though. In Canada, we actually get a maternity leave, whereas in the US they don't. You have to take sort of like sick leave. So I think that is that's just an important, and not just in academia, but well, maybe it's more in academia, but I do think that's an important difference. But other than that, I would say that it's a very identical experience, at least for me.
Interestingly enough, I just read a study, a very recent study that came out that did a survey of academics in Canada and the US and looked at how much new parents were taking advantage of leave policies offered to them at different institutions. So in the US, even though the United States doesn't have the same government mandated maternity leave that we have here, different institutions have different policies about leaves. And it turns out that, interestingly, the study showed that men academics in Canada take less paternity leave than men academics in the United States, despite it being more available in Canada. And I thought that that was a really interesting statistic, and a really interesting, feature of or difference between the countries, that despite the fact that we have more generous parental leave policies in Canada, that the uptake, at least among men, for paternity leave is not that high, and something that we could probably have a longer discussion about. But yeah. Maydianne, do you also, I think I think it should have been obvious from our intros that actually Molly, Maydianne, and I all did our PhDs in the United States. So we have this kind of, point of comparison on the degree to which the picture of scientists and the stories told by the scientists in the film really, match or don't match our experiences as Canadian academics.
Yeah, I would say the same. And actually, I would point people, if they're interested, to a podcast called Color Code with Denise Balkasoon and Hannah Sung. It's from 2016, so it's really interesting. It's pre-Trump. And one of their episodes is called The Angel Complex, and I'll just let you guess what that is about. It's about Canadians pointing south and saying we're so much better than. And one of the real lessons, I think, of thinking about equity, diversity, inclusion, it's not oppression Olympics. It's not who's being more oppressed. It's that we want to get everyone to a particular level. And I think some of these stories are just so common, sadly, across societies and across countries, that they need a more systematic approach, and they need people to stop saying that we're pretty good because we think we're better than.
Right. And I guess one other thing I will say is that in my experience, also, Canada has tended to lag behind the United States on collecting data on how identity factors are influencing outcomes in academia. And as a result, sometimes I think we don't even know the degree to which we don't know the size of the gaps that we're facing because we haven't been doing enough monitoring of them, in my opinion. And something that I've tried to do personally is to use what data is out there and to analyze what data is out there to shed more light on those kinds of gaps, because I think that we can't move forward and judge our progress, to monitor how well we are doing or how well we're not doing, in the absence of better data on how gender, but also race and disability and many other identity factors are influencing the progress of individuals as they move on through science, and as they encounter different career stages in academia.
Can I just want to agree with you wholeheartedly. I think it's really true that we don't have the data, and we do have some resistance in terms of getting the data. But I just wanted to come back to one thing that I really appreciated about the film as well. was, and this is something, you know, like what we're trying to do and what this film does is how to ask the question of like, how do we change society, right? And this is, I think, you know, what underscores our discussion tonight. And we can't do it with women alone. And I really appreciated the men, some of the men in the film coming out. So for example, like the president of BU coming out in support of the women who had made the complaints and actually going against his own faculty council to take that really hard decision. And I think that's really important, that if we want to change society, that we do have to bring men and women together to, and we need allies, not just amongst women, but amongst men as well.
Yes, I very much agree. And actually, I wanted to ask Ian a little bit about one of the parts of the film that I found really striking was the comments of, and I've just forgotten his name, but the student who was on this the same field expedition in Antarctica with Jane Willenbring, who saw all of this, you know, bullying and harassment of her in the field, and then was interviewed for the film, saying, you know, yes, I saw all of it, and I never knew how much it affected you. And I thought his comments were intriguing, and I wondered, you know, what's the backstory in terms of having gotten him involved in Picture a Scientist? And
Adam Lewis.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, he is a really interesting character, and I think, I mean, most humans are interesting characters. We don't always succeed in portraying them as such. We sometimes get, especially in movies, I don't know, people can be sort of archetypes or one-dimensional. And I hope, I am sure, because we've talked to a lot of people about the film, that people react very differently to Adam. And I think that's okay. I think there's some sense of like, how could you, you know, you put yourself back in, and how could you not see what was going on? And I think there's also a way in which he is, you know, kind of a proxy for maybe a lot of men, and maybe an opportunity for a lot of men to try and see what they haven't seen, and try and acknowledge what they haven't seen, and to ask why they haven't seen it, you know. And
yeah, I had these kind of, you know, this kind of on the fence reaction. That on the one hand, I was sort of like, why didn't you do anything about this at the time? You watched this happen and did nothing. On the other hand, I think many of us have watched things happen and done nothing and felt guilty about it later, knowing that that we should have acted in the moment and didn't. We should have spoke up when we saw wrong, and we didn't. On the other hand, I thought it was brave that he, you know, participated in the film and seemed to genuinely engage in kind of the reckoning that happened over David Marchand's treatment of Jane Willenbring and then others. One of whom, of course, remains anonymous in the film as well, right? We don't see one of the speakers' names or identifying information. So yeah, so I had this kind of, you know, mixed emotions, if you like, watching him speak. And
Can I ask one piece about that? When we do education sessions and workshops on equity, one of the things we do is actually help people with phrases to use to disrupt these kinds of behaviors, because I do think it requires work, it requires forethought, and when there's a power imbalance, because of course that would have affected him as well, it's sometimes hard to decide what to do. So that's the kind of thing I actually encourage people to think actively about, and that's one of the things I loved about the film, was making, as you say, Ian, putting yourself in that position, thinking, yeah, what would I have done? I'll be honest that for me, the more overt things, people often say, I didn't just see that. I couldn't have just seen that. The gendered slurs, there's no other way to interpret that. The names she was called, that just becomes very hard to understand, because that's the iceberg analogy again, right, Molly? Like, you start with these kind of slurs and you're building up to something that's more and more and more egregious and unacceptable.
Yeah, thanks for making that point. I think that's absolutely right. You know, it's really doesn't go without saying that it does take work to sort of equip ourselves with, you know, just repeating what you said, but I really want to underline it because it's something that I've thought so much about. You know, yeah, I don't know what to say here. I don't know the script. I want to do something, but I can't. So finding that voice and helping people find that voice is so important.
And I think another thing we hear a lot, I hear a lot as a woman in science, and I think a lot of people wondered about is this issue you brought up right at the beginning, Ian, I guess, is how much progress has been made, or the extent to which these problems are really in the past. And I will say, I guess, that in the film, two of the three main stories really do recount events of the past, right? So Nancy Hopkins, in describing the MIT report, where she's going out measuring the sizes of labs at MIT, that's a study that came out in the mid-90s. And I guess Jane Willenbring, when she's describing this very serious episodes of bullying and harassment in Antarctica, it's I think she says that it's 17 years since, from the time that it happened to when she filed the Title IX complaint. And so I think a lot of people think, oh, that was something that happened back then, but doesn't happen now. And I was sort of curious to get all of your views on the degree to which that's true. Have we made progress, or, are these things still very much happening? Where do we stand, now in 2021? Maydianne, maybe you want to go first?
Sure. So things are better. I think things are definitely better. If we look even at things like representation in scientific fields, it's much better than it was. It varies by field quite substantively, and the year-over-year improvement varies substantively. And so if you actually look at the data for people's participation, women's participation in these fields, we're much better than we were, but it will take far too long to get to equitable representation in some fields unless we do something active. And one of the things that we've seen that has been done that's active is requiring that universities meet targets for representation in certain areas. Given that we know that excellence is not bound by gender or by race, we should be able to find equal representation of people getting the highest level of awards and things like Canada Research Chairs. And we've seen quite clearly that it's only when people are pushed to it by saying, this is the target. If you don't approach this target, you don't get any more, right? That's what works, is a truth. So we need more active engagement, but we are getting better.
Yeah, I think that, the Canada Research Chairs example is an excellent one. Ian, you may not be familiar with this, but to the extent that the MIT study and the work of Nancy Hopkins is kind of this, foundational narrative about gender inequality in sciences in the US, the sort of equivalent narrative or series of events that in Canada that really has grounded a lot of what we know about gender inequality in particular, is the creation of these very prestigious research chairs, the Canada Research Chairs, in, I think it was the year 2000. And they initially went, overwhelmingly to men. And actually the program was the subject of two Canadian human rights complaints, formal complaints to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal over their allocation and the bias in the process and the bias in awarding these prestigious chairs largely to men. And in response, the Canadian Human Rights Commission required that the Canada Research Chairs actually set these targets for the percent of chairs that need to go to women and to Indigenous people and to people who identify as racialized and to people who self-identify as having a disability. I think those are the four categories. And there has been a lot of improvement, and yet the Canada Research Chair still stands at about, it's about a third, I can't remember the latest number, but it's about a third of the research chairs currently go to women, for example. So it's definitely progress, but it's not equity yet. So
and maybe I could just add, yeah, I think, you know, the biggest improvement we have is awareness. And that's the first step. And of course, I think we have much better gender representation. You know, I'm in the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering, and we have more women faculty, but that only came with intentional change. And, you know, that's what you're talking about with the CRC program. But I would say there's still a lot of BS going on in the iceberg. A lot of that, there's like, I hear of stuff every day, and I'm including, you know, today, where whether it's men or women, just, and you know, unfortunately it's mostly men, but just saying things that are so inappropriate in a professional setting. You know, they're just so inappropriate, but they're, you know, it's like, keep that, you know, maybe just keep that to yourself if you know. So there's a lot that we've improved on the outside, and I think, you know, I have the opportunity to serve on a public board in the auto parts manufacturing of an auto parts manufacturing company, and they're actively trying to, you know, get women on the board because they recognize the importance of diversity. And so there are companies, you know, the private sector, the public sector, aware and trying to do the right thing, but there's still a lot of BS going on below that iceberg.
I would say that matches my experience well too, right? I definitely think there's progress. I mean, the fact that the three of us are here speaking today is evidence of progress. You know, if you take, especially over a long enough, you know, over a long enough period of time, if you take a long enough view, but at the same time, I also regularly see things that really deeply concern me about women and the treatment of other sort of historically excluded groups very regularly. And I would like to see it stop.
And can I just say, we really do need to mention intersectionality, because most of the advances have been for white women. The almost erasure of racialized women is really notable. I know on my campus, which is a very diverse campus and has been very successful in diversifying the faculty, I have been, and I'm still, the only Black woman professor in the sciences writ large, all science departments, and that's been true for 20 years. And I know the same is true at other institutions. So some of these issues happen quite early. We talked about, like, I actually saw in the comments there's someone saying what's happening with, and Molly mentioned what's happening with girls, those little ears that are hearing things from quite early on. And why is it that they're not entering the field? And then when they enter the field, they have to deal with all these barriers, right? It resonated with me when Jane said, the only people who you see here are the ones who laugh it off, no matter how much it's wounding them, no matter how fundamentally they're damaged by it. Their ability to put on a public face is required to succeed. And we are losing all those other people who are not able to put on that face.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the comments and story of Rachel Burks in the film also speaks to this really extremely well, about her experience also being the only you know, Black woman scientist in the natural sciences, I think she says at her university, and the experience of coming up in the sciences without, you know, seeing many or even any people who look like her working in the field. And I think we're still at that point in many, many disciplines and many, many institutions. One thing I think about sometimes when I think about the progress that has been made, I worry that we have done sort of the easy things, that we've tackled some of the things that are kind of easy fixes, but we haven't done a lot of the hard work to make sort of lasting change and to do things that cost money and take time and require us to really confront, many things about, our complicity in various aspects of the system. I worry about the, that the rate of change we may not be able to make a lot of progress going forward unless we actually sort of commit to tackling things that often do cost money and require sort of real systemic changes in the system. I mean,
Yeah,
just for one.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, just for one example, we have larger and larger numbers of women faculty members, and women are well represented among graduate students in the sciences, for example, and reasonably well represented at the postdoctoral level. But there's no place to breastfeed an infant or pump breast milk in my building. No private place for graduate students or postdocs who have an infant and have to breastfeed in my building. We still have a lack of childcare. There's many things that we could work on, and we still have a lot of progress to make, I think. Molly?
Yeah, well, you took the discussion a different way.
We're going to go somewhere else.
But yeah, but anyways, that's okay. I think those are really, really critical and important points to make. And I was just thinking, I often thought of my mom's generation as being the trailblazers, and they were, but there's still a lot of trails to blaze. So that's a challenge. And I think, I guess what you've highlighted is, let's not be complacent now that we've actually overcome these challenges, because as you've pointed out, and as Maydianne has pointed out, there's still significant challenges and significant opportunities to do better. And I'd say significant opportunities to hold ourselves, all of us, accountable to doing better. And so I think there's great opportunities to do a better job. And when people ask me, like, why do we need women in science? And I think the film made this point as well. Like, if we're going to ignore half the population, we're really, like, we face really big challenges. And as Melanie said in her opening remarks about, just even COVID-19, right? So if we're going to ignore half the population, we're really not going to overcome the big challenges that we face in the world. But there's still a large population, as Maydianne pointed out, in the and lack of representation of the Black and also the Indigenous population in Canada, that we really haven't addressed fully, and we really have to do. And one thing that we realized with women in STEM is it wasn't just enough to get more people in the pipeline. We still had to actively change. And I think that's the same thing that we have to do with these other represented groups. And so actually one thing is, I was an undergraduate at MIT between 1983 and 1987. And when I came in, it was 23% women. And by the time I left, it was about 40% women. And so that happened through intentional change, right? And that's, I think that's our hope for the future, is that we continue with that what we've been doing, and with the CRCs, and the future keeps, with intentional change.
Absolutely, but it requires data to know where we are and how fast we're moving towards those targets. But absolutely. I do actually want to talk briefly about the pandemic. Ian, the picture of scientists must have been filmed entirely pre-pandemic, because I don't see anybody wearing a mask. I think it's interesting to think about what the COVID-19 pandemic has done to women in science, and also to other underrepresented groups in science. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about not just sort of we've been talking about progress over maybe the last few decades, but has the pandemic set us back? Is it setting us back? And I admit that this is a loaded question, because I have given this issue some thought myself. I'd be interested in hearing your perspectives.
Sorry, were you asking Ian or any of
Well,
us?
Maydianne, go ahead. I guess, I mean, Ian, presumably, you know, the filming had entirely wrapped up before COVID started.
Yes, I'd love to hear what Maydianne's. I can talk a little bit about a sort of a different angle on that same question, because I think in some ways there's been partly the pandemic, partly the murder of George Floyd. I think there's been a real kind of opening up of difficult conversations, even in virtual spaces. But that's a different aspect of this, and we can get to that later.
Maydianne?
I think Ian's right, though. That is really closely related to this. But I do think that there was I won't say unforgivable, but a hard to understand blinders on with respect to what this would do to women and to equity issues. As long as people, I've said this before, as long as people think that equitable opportunity and that justice is icing instead of cake, when we suffer a crisis, the icing goes. And I'm worried that that has happened here in one way. In another way, as Ian suggested, it's opened our eyes in ways that they weren't open before. Well, some of us had our eyes open before, but it's opened a broader conversation. So I think hopefully we'll move past that. But the problem is that I think what was happening all along, almost anyone could have predicted would have led us where we are now, which is women are suffering huge deficits. Women scientists, in particular, those who have children, they're suffering in ways that it's going to be very hard to recover from, unless universities, unless research institutions become very intentional about supporting their re-entry into active research.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I guess I will say I've done a little bit of research on this myself and documented some of these patterns where there's really emerging evidence, despite us only being 15 months into the COVID-19 pandemic. There's already strong evidence that it's setting back the careers of women in science and women academics more generally. And it's probably, at least, I think my personal opinion is that it's largely driven by the difference in caregiving burdens and the fact that we took school and childcare away from a generation of women in an attempt to control the virus, and then said, hey, but you still have to do your full-time jobs. Although there are also other reasons why women may have been disproportionately affected by the onset of the pandemic. But I've also heard, that, for example, living our virtual lives this way has been very freeing for a lot of people who live with disabilities, because of a lot of things that previously we all said, oh, it's just too complicated to make that work. Why could, virtual conferences, why would we do that? All of a sudden these things became possible, and that some amount of online engagement facilitated interactions and networking for some group of people that had been excluded. So while I've largely viewed the pandemic as a real setback for many underrepresented groups, especially women, but probably more broadly than that too, it has been, it has led to some very rapid cultural changes in the way that we do science and the way that we live as academics that may be worth keeping in the long run.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those things that you just said, in terms of this has created a better, more equitable space for people with disabilities, because this is just an accepted way of meeting. But I think, and so I don't have any, it sounds like you've collected data, and it's only things that I've heard. I think it's been very hard on families with young children, not just necessarily the women, probably disproportionately women, if they're, as Maydianne said, if they're the icing versus the cake. in terms of them having jobs, or if their jobs pay less, then, you know, if you have to make a choice, like it's just economics, you know, it's just financial, you have to make a choice. But I can tell you, like in my own lab, I've always really strived to have equal numbers of men and women in the lab. I think I could have all men or all women in my lab, and I've always strived to have a balance. And but you know, my postdocs, my grad students, they actually have to be in the lab in order to work, and so they've had to come up with an equity situation if they have young children with their families in order to make that work. But then that's just like, turns out who has that type of relationship, you know, and so it becomes very one-on-one.
I guess to circle back to Ian about, you know, the recent events and the pandemic and also the murder of George Floyd, I guess one thing I wanted to ask you specifically is, I assume that when you make a documentary, you know, I don't know anything about making films, but I assume that you have to make a lot of choices about things you leave out, right? Because you can't put it all in 90 minutes or whatever the length of the documentary is. And, you know, are there any parts or any things you left out that you wish you hadn't? Or I guess if you were going to make a sequel to Picture a Scientist, I don't know if people do that for documentaries really, but, you know, imagine you're making sort of the follow-up. Are there some recent events that would sort of spur you to make a different film or film that covered different ground?
Yeah, it's true. Documentaries don't often have sequels, and I don't know what, you know, like Nancy's Revenge or something, a sort of thriller action movie. Would be actually really fun to pitch that to Nancy. But as it happens, so there definitely, you know, a lot of footage, sort of our data, I guess, that we gathered that we couldn't fit into the film, and some of those are really, really hard decisions. You know, there's a pretty deep and fascinating and important history of kind of how science came to be the way it is, and a lot of those stories are I think incredibly important, and had to sort of fall by the wayside so we could stay more or less in the present. But there's also a set of things, Sharon and I are both Caucasian, there's also a set of things that we sort of knew we weren't really the right people to wade into with this film. Issues of intersectionality and racism in science. And that's, even though we were really lucky to have Rachel Burks in the film, she sort of carried this weight of the only non-white lead woman character in the film. And I think we all felt like a sequel could dive much more deeply into the story of racism in science. And so we're actually embarking on a set of films right now that Sharon and I won't direct, but we're just helping to make happen, that will kind of simultaneously explore the history and state of racism in science, but also explore ways forward, innovative programs and individuals who are trying to say, okay, let's, you know, here's, because that was something we got a lot after watching the film, was the sense of a desire for examples of ways forward. And the way we're building those films is actually sort of meant to parallel what we're seeing in the world of science, which is an attempt to empower more younger people of color to have careers, in our case, in film. So we're trying to sort of what is it? Walk the walk, walk the talk, whatever the expression is. We're trying to, because these problems, of course, are really prevalent in the world of film. I mean, the whole Me Too movement in many ways was at least very publicly related to the film world. So so Sharon and I are really keen on trying to make these new set of films also an opportunity for us to talk about and look at and address the ways in which these systemic issues, racism and sexism, other inequalities exist in film, even as we are making portraits of the world of science. So I don't know if that made sense, but that's what we're embarking on now.
Yeah, absolutely. It actually would segue, I think, pretty well into a couple of the audience submitted questions. So I want to turn our attention to some of the questions that the audience submitted through the, I think there was an online form, and then that have been coming up in the chat. And I guess the first one is a question related to how do we continue to make real progress, and how do we actually, what are some of the solutions? What do we do about some of these issues that are so, well highlighted in the film? And so one of these audience submitted questions was, what do we say to colleagues who don't recognize these issues as current problems? And one of the questions that was submitted through the chat was related. It asked, how do graduate students deal with discrimination and power imbalances at the graduate level? How can you speak out and get help when it's usually men in the top positions where these issues are supposed to be reported? So how do we empower graduate students to speak out when they've been negatively affected, discriminated against, harassed, and so on? And how do we convince our colleagues who might still have some skepticism that these are issues that need to be addressed?
I think those are really fantastic questions, and I don't think there's a simple answer. One of the things that we started to do in our department, and I know a lot of other departments do this, not just at the University of Toronto, but across the United States, and I'm sure Canada as well, is we've started to have what's called or use the individual development plan. So that is a way to try to professionalize the relationship between the graduate student and the supervisor. And it's really about actually being quite intentional about what you want to do in graduate school and when you want to do it. And at least that opens the conversation. And for sure, at least in our department and many departments, you have an advisory committee. And so if your own supervisor isn't responding, you can, that is a mechanism that you can at least try to get support. One thing that I advise graduate students, and I did this myself when I was choosing a lab, when I was trying to find a lab to join, I didn't actually join the lab that I was most interested in. I actually joined the lab where I really liked the people the most. And so I joined a lab based on the lab culture. And I think, even as students, as graduate students, you have choice. You probably have more choice than you appreciate. And like, if you're a strong student, you always have choice. And so I think it's really important to understand the lab and the lab culture and the people in the lab before choosing to join a lab. Because, my advice, I often speak and give like a top 10 list of things sort of to do, not to do, not just in graduate school, but just to professional women as well. And my number one of the top 10 is always, avoid the assholes, because I think it's very hard to change people's positions, right? And so like, that question of like, how do I get somebody who doesn't think there's a problem to believe there's a problem? And, I guess the best way is what Nancy did, was with data. But even when you show people data, they might say, well, I don't believe it, and so like, then what do you do? And I think that's the problem that she came up with as well. But then it's getting allies, not just other women, but men as well, or maybe like bring women together. And then that's a bigger, so then it's not one person, but it's a group of people. And I think that's what she did as well. And those are great things for us to all learn from.
And I think, one thing I would really like to see is us work towards having mechanisms in place where, the somebody who's treated the way Jane Willenbring was treated by David Marchand, as reported in the film, does not have to wait 17 years to make a complaint and can still go on to be successful in their career, even if they make a complaint when they are a master's student or a PhD student, or one of the career stages that Jane Willenbring would have been when she experienced that kind of harassment. And I think we do a disservice to our trainees, to our graduate students and postdocs, if we don't offer a way to be able to move forward as scientists while simultaneously, saying this happened to me and it needs to be addressed. And, it can't come back then to derail the person's career. And I don't know yet that we have those mechanisms in place, but I do think that that is something that we desperately need in science departments almost everywhere to prevent, it taking so long for somebody to be able to be in a position to make a complaint that makes change about bullying and sexual harassment and other types of unacceptable behaviors.
Can I just say one thing, and this is partly going back to what Ian was talking about in terms of this being a particular point in time. If you are a graduate student in a department who's been experiencing some of these things, and this is a very practical advice right now, you aren't going to be the only one. I'm really sad to say you are not going to be the only one. It won't necessarily be traced to the same person, but there are cultures in some units that make this type of thing easier to happen. This is a particular moment when a group of graduate students who come together and write to their chair or their dean and say, something needs to change. We need a clear pathway for making these kinds of complaints that is safe for us. And I think this is a unique time when you might get rapid action on that. So I'm just going to put that on the table.
Absolutely. And first of all, I should say there were many really great questions that were submitted by the audience. We're not going to have time to get to all of them tonight, but we only have a few minutes left before we start to wrap up. But I do want to get to a couple of questions that I think hopefully might be a nice note to end on. And one of these questions was submitted by someone in the audience. And the question was, if you had to do it all over again, would you still want to be a scientist? And I want to say, absolutely. I love my job. And I really love having the freedom to pursue my intellectual or scholarly interests. And I really love working with graduate students and postdocs in my lab and seeing them flourish and thrive as scientists. And it's an extremely satisfying job. So even though we can talk about, many of the things that have been discouraging to us, or the many of the things we would like to see improved for women, for Black and Indigenous scientists, for other members of historically excluded groups, I think, and there certainly are some downsides we need to work on. I do want to say it's an amazing job and I would never choose another one. And I would be interested to hear what Maydianne and Molly have to say as well.
Science is more than my job. It's just me. I don't know what else I would be doing. I do also love it, and it is a lens through which I see the world. I would love it if I had a grand unifying theory of everything. I don't yet, but maybe someday, together with all these great colleagues. So yeah, I agree. There's problems in any profession and there's problems in any field. These are universal problems. I can show you the data from across sectors, sadly. We're all as a society moving towards improvements, but do what you love, and recognize that the sexism or the racism or intersectionalityism is their problem. You do have to learn to be resilient to it, which I think comes from community. Largely community, and also I noticed some parents saying that. It comes from your parents, your family, whoever is saying, we know you can do this. And I think that's the best thing you can do for someone. We
Absolutely,
know you can do
I
this.
couldn't agree more. One of the other questions on the chat was, what advice would we give to young women about how to stay grounded and self-confident as they pursue careers in our fields? And I'll repeat a piece of advice that echoes what Maydianne just said, which is that my PhD supervisor, Deborah Gordon, who's a professor at Stanford University, when I used to go to her and say, you know, I had this experience, which I think, you know, was basically gender discrimination, or even I had this experience where I had some criticism, I just didn't really believe it. She would often say, you need to figure out whether that's about you or about them. And if it's not about you, don't worry about it, right? The things that are other people's problems, let them be other people's problems, in terms of, like, you know, don't absorb the sort of, you know, the opinions and the bias of people out there. Sort of stick to your guns was a lot of the message that she would have for me. And I think it is really good advice for others, but it is advice we do need to actively sort of pass along to other people, to say it's okay to sort of, you know, stay true to your interest and what you love about science. Molly?
Yeah, I would agree. And, you know, I think everybody lacks self-confidence at all stages of their careers. I still lack it, you know, as well. And so it's not that it ever goes away, but, you know, I think women stereotypically won't put themselves out there. They won't raise their hand. They won't go for that promotion. That's the stereotype. So I think, and sometimes I see it in myself as well, having that self-doubt, and I know the statistics, and so it drives me crazy about myself. So I think, you know, it's something I guess Maydianne said, like, you're not alone if you have self-doubt, but you have to just put it in a corner and go forth, you know, and do your best. And you know, nobody else is going to see it unless you show it to people. So, you know, it's a little bit of just burying that self-doubt. I mean, it's obviously not easy to do, but I think it's really critical to do. And I also love my job. And, you know, it is one of the jobs where, you know, there's no beginning or end to our days, unfortunately. But because of that, I was able to, you know, I coached my kids' soccer teams. I took them to their doctor's appointments. I was, you know, went to their piano recital. So, like, I was able to be very engaged in my children's lives and at the same time have a very successful career, you know, because when they went to bed, I went back to work, you know. But so, you know, I might not have much of a life, but it's been such a great life and such a flexible life. And this idea that, you know, you have an idea, and if you can convince your peers that it's a good idea, then you can get funding and you can pursue it, and you can try to answer those questions that nobody in the world has ever been able to answer. That's so exciting. And it's so exciting to me to think about inventing the future. And, you know, so that's what motivates me every day, you know. And it's not like, and you know what, you'll never get there. It's like the finish line is always moving, because you're always coming up with a bigger question or a better question or a more interesting question, or, you know, but that's what's so exciting about our careers.
And on that note, I want to thank Molly and Ian and Maydianne for your comments tonight and for our discussion. And it seems like a perfect transition to inviting Francisca to speak, who's going to close out our program tonight. So I'm going to introduce Francisca. Francisca UofT is an Innis student and soon to be University of Toronto graduate. Congratulations, this June with her bachelor's degree in neuroscience and physiology. She's been working behind the scenes at Innis by assisting with the virtual events at the college. And tonight she's here to provide a student perspective on the importance of women in science. So Francisca, take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Megan. Good evening, everyone. And thank you as well, Charlie, for inviting me to come out from my usual behind the scenes role at these Innis events to speak and provide a student perspective to this discussion. First of all, thank you, Maydianne, Molly, Megan, and Ian for this great conversation. I really appreciate everything that was said and feel an extra jolt of inspiration to continue in the sciences and pursue higher levels of academia and research. And I hope the audience felt that same inspiration and admiration as well. being a woman, specifically a Black woman, and with all the obstacles that come with that, it is very impactful for me to see and hear from current women who are at the top of the field. I feel that it is so important to have female scientists, mentors, and professors like yourselves at high levels throughout the various schools of science to increase the visibility of women and to change the culture and the system, which we all agree is the root of the issue. Even as a graduate now, I can look back on my time at U of T, and thankfully I did have very key female professors who made an impression on me and enhanced my experience by providing advice and simply being there to show that it is possible. And that if I decide to continue on into academia or higher levels of education, I will be met by other women who have endured the same process. So thank you all once again for this great conversation. Thank you, Megan, Molly, and Maydianne for being beacons of inspiration for up and coming females in science like myself. And thank you, Ian, for creating this film and highlighting these important stories. So I'll pass it on to Charlie for the closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Francisca. It's nice to be able to give you the forum when you've been so helpful behind the scenes for so long. I want to say just again, thanks to all of our panelists, Maydianne, Molly, and Ian, for a really great and galvanizing conversation. I hope people will tell other people about this film, and that, as was said early in the conversation, that we not become complacent, both because we're Canadians and because we're at U of T. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with someone who knew Melissa Franklin, who is an alumna of Innis, who didn't choose to go into the physics department at U of T and went instead to Harvard because she didn't feel welcome at U of T at that time within that department. I'm not singling out that department by any means. I'm just saying that that climate, which Anne Innis Dagg experienced during her academic career, which was foreshortened because of it, and what other women have experienced, we can only hope that by the efforts made by leaders like Molly and Maydianne will change, and by Melanie, to foster the kind of environment where students like Francisca will feel supported and will then want to continue in the field, because that's essential. So thanks so much. Thank you, Melanie, for coming and giving greetings. Thank you to Anne for just being Anne. It's just, she's a remarkable person who has spent her 88 years, well, maybe not all 88 of them, but many of them, fighting for, I mean, she, you know, the term pioneer gets overused, but Anne was fighting this fight back in the 70s. And so she's been at it for a long time. She's been a scientist pretty much her whole life, but she's also been a woman scientist fighting against the strictures that female scientists have experienced. So thanks again to all of you. Megan, you did a stalwart job. No, it's not easy being a moderator. And I just, after this cavalcade of things, I'll just do what's really supposed to be my job, which is to tell everyone about our next event. And that is on June 14th at 7 p.m. We'll have another one of our book events, and the featured author will be CSI alumna Michelle Orange, and the book is Pure Flame. And I'm very much looking forward to reading it and seeing Michelle sometime. And I just want to direct people's attention to 3 different things you should give some attention to yourself. And that is the Dorothy Schoeckett Women Faculty of Excellence Award. I think that was Molly's mom. Of course, the Anne Innis Dagg Foundation, and never neglect and listen to it all you can, Maydianne's wonderful podcast, The New Normal. So there's some things you can take away with you. We don't have any parting gifts, but these are plenty gifts enough, I think. So thanks again to all of our contributors this evening. And watch that film if you haven't seen it yet, and tell everyone else about it. So good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for coming, everyone. It's wonderful.